This teenager went missing and nobody noticed for 17 years. Her disappearance was so odd that police began to question whether she ever existed. This is the case of Margaret Fleming. Margaret was born in 1980 in Scotland and she had learning difficulties. This meant that she needed carers throughout her whole life into adulthood. Aged 13, her parents divorced and Margaret moved in with her father to her grandparents' house. Her mother describes Margaret as being difficult to handle and ill-tempered. However, teachers described her as being a quiet, isolated child who needed a lot of encouragement and support. She wouldn't really read or write without one-on-one help. In 1995, aged 15, Margaret's father is diagnosed with terminal cancer. Now, Margaret doesn't know why her father is in hospital, but she is very concerned and worried. Her father is her only real friend and reliable adult in her life. It's just the two of them, and tragically, he loses his battle to cancer. Margaret is distraught and lonely, and she initially moves in with her mother, but her mother really cannot cope. Margaret's father, knowing that he was going to die, and he realised that his parents were too old to give Margaret the care that she needed, appointed two family friends to be his daughter's appointed carers. Now these were Edward and Avril Jones. Initially she didn't solely live with Edward and Avril, she flitted between their home and her mother's house. Edward and Avril lived in a very dilapidated bungalow in the town over from Port Glasgow. It was around a 20-minute car ride, which wouldn't seem much to us, but Margaret, who had learning difficulties, who couldn't drive, that was basically a whole world away. Margaret's mother, however, couldn't cope, and she found it very difficult looking after her daughter. She said that Margaret would come home in a foul mood and beat her. Their relationship just gets worse over time, and Margaret's mother reaches out to social services to say, "I need help." But due to some unfortunate events, social services being understaffed and their caseworker going on maternity leave, this request is never followed up. This situation takes a turn for the worse in November 1997. On the evening of the 26th, Margaret's mother, who's also called Margaret, arrives at Edward and Avril's house to pick up her daughter. But Edward attacks Margaret's mother. She states, "He started to assault me. He banged me up against a wardrobe and threw me over a chair and said he wanted me out of the house, and he spat in my face." Edward and Avril then brought Margaret into the room and asked, "Who would you like to stay with?" To which she replied, "Here," as in Edward and Avril's bungalow. Margaret's mother couldn't really do anything. She said Margaret seemed nervous, but what was she to do? She couldn't force her daughter to come home. So she returned home and then immediately phoned the police to do a welfare check on her daughter. The police arrived and said that Margaret seemed well. There was nothing untoward going on. So that was that. And that was basically the last time Margaret's mother ever saw her daughter. So Margaret's now living full-time in Inverkip with Edward and Avril, which, as I say, is the next town over. She doesn't know anyone in this town, and she becomes more and more reclusive. She tries to self-harm, and Edward later states that he had to put cardboard boxes over her arms to stop her from harming herself. 2 years later, in October 1999, Margaret goes to see her GP, who refers her to a psychologist. He said that Margaret appeared socially and educationally isolated. This is the last time she's seen by a doctor. The last confirmed sighting of Margaret is 2 months later, in December of 1999, when she goes to visit Richard Jones's house, who's Avril Jones's brother. Richard and Avril's mother is also there, Florence, who described Margaret as being very quiet and unable to take care of herself. Florence also recounts that Margaret wasn't there on Christmas Day. 3 weeks later, on January 5th, 2000, Florence calls her daughter Avril, who goes on to tell her that Margaret has run away with some travellers. Florence doesn't really think anything of it. She doesn't know Margaret that well. So Margaret's mother has no contact with her. Her father has passed away and her grandparents are elderly. The only other sort of extended relative that she knows, which is Avril's mother and brother, they've explained that she'd run off with travellers. So no one is questioning where Margaret is. Months turn into years, until nearly 17 years later, when there is a clerical change in the benefits system. So October 2016, and due to this admin change, Margaret has to reapply for her benefits. Now Avril does this for her, and this raises a red flag in the system to say that no one has been to see this vulnerable adult in a very long time. So social services and the benefits department try to get in contact with Margaret, and Avril and Edward are coming up with all these weird excuses as to why she's not there. They can't get in contact with her, she's not coming down to the offices to reapply for her benefits, so they contact the police. The police arrive at their bungalow and see no sign of Margaret Fleming, so immediately launch an investigation. Over this 17-year period where Margaret has not been seen, Edward and Avril have claimed over £180,000 in benefits on her behalf. So when police arrive, they begin showing them these letters, supposedly from Margaret, saying, oh, she's gone travelling, she's here and there with sort of travellers around Europe. When police launch this investigation, they take these letters to Margaret's old teachers, who confirm outright that there's no way Margaret could have written these. She couldn't read and write that well, if really at all. So Edward Kearney and Avril Jones are under investigation, and their excuses get wilder and wilder as to where Margaret is. So Avril claims that she had been going to collect Margaret's benefits because on one time when she went with Margaret, Margaret refused to go, pushed Avril over and just ran away. Edward is also claiming that she is out with travellers across Europe, that at one point that she's got fake passports, she's using fake aliases. He even says at one point that she's in Poland working as a gang master, hiring agriculturals and dealing in illegal drugs. The stories just get crazier and crazier, and the police just do not believe it at all. Before they even contact Margaret's teachers, where there was no trace of Margaret in that bungalow or anyone really that knew her immediately, they did question at one point as to whether Edward and Avril had just made up this person in order to claim the allowances. After speaking to old teachers and also to Avril's mum and brother Richard and Florence, it became clear that Margaret did exist and that Edward and Avril had took advantage of her. They wanted her benefits money, but they didn't want the inconvenience of actually having to look after her. So using the timeline of when she was last confirmed to have been seen, which is in the December of 1999 at Avril's brother's house, and when Avril began to say to her mother that Margaret had gone, that was a 3-week period between December 1999 and January of 2000. Police think that Margaret was murdered sometime within that 3-week period. In 2018, they were taken to trial, and both Avril and Edward were found guilty of murdering Margaret Fleming and perverting the course of justice. They were given a life sentence with a minimum term of 14 years before parole can be granted. Jones was also found guilty of fraud and ordered to pay back the £182,000 worth of benefits that she had claimed. Despite doing an extensive search of that bungalow, which was just filled with rubbish, and the garden was just full of junk as well, they never found Margaret's remains. 15th of October 2023 last year, Edward Kearney died in prison, aged 82. That was the very sad case of Margaret Fleming. If you have any case suggestions, please let me know in the comments below. If you like my content, please remember to like, subscribe and comment, and I will see you next time.